Hi everyone, and welcome to the Imagining a New We video blog with me, Dr. Samantha Cotrera, a video series designed to help history teachers and other history educators teach history in ways that are more meaningful, transformative, and inclusive for their students. I mean, it seems redundant to say that when I started the Pandemic Pedagogy video series at the end of March by talking to people in the history and heritage field about whether or not their ideas about history have changed during this time, what they think about teaching history after COVID, and whether or not they think we can imagine a new we, which is the overall theme of this video series, differently during and after this moment. You know, when I've talked to these scholars, never did we talk about, oh, there could be some real activism happening right in the middle of the pandemic that really is going to force change in ways that are actually making change. And that is what is so exhilarating about the social activism, the resistance that is happening right now. When I did the Pandemic Pedagogy series, I reached out to a lot of different educators that I knew, but then also that I got to meet through Twitter and things like that, and asked them to be a part of the series. And a couple people were like, I would love to, but the timing isn't great. And hey, that's cool. The invitation is always open. The person that we are going to talk to today is one of those people. I've spoken to a few people from the States, and I reached out to her because I said, I haven't talked to anyone from the American South. Would you like to talk for the series? And she said, yeah, let me think about it. And then she got in touch in the last week and she's like, let's talk about this revolution that's happening right now. And I'm like, yes, let's talk about it right now. So while there is often a little bit of a buffer between when I record the videos and when they go up, this video, like one that I had last week, was recorded and it's going up pretty much 3 or 4 days later, because this is such a timely and pressing and exciting issue. So I'm very, very excited that this person got in touch with me and that we are going to talk for the series today. Today we are talking to Dr. Kristen Duncan. Dr. Duncan is a professor in social studies education at Clemson University in South Carolina. She's also taught at Texas State University, which is kind of interesting, like a different kind of context. She focuses on helping teacher candidates in high school think about history education in ways that they can translate into their practices when they get into the classroom. Her research, though, is specifically focused on how Black teachers talk about race in the classroom and the representation of race in social studies text, a variety of different formal and informal text. And I think that those research interests and the fact that she teaches history teachers bring so much to this conversation, but she was also a middle school teacher. And so being in the classroom and having those experiences, especially for middle school, grade 7, 8, which is a difficult, terrible grade to teach, can bring a lot to it. She also got her PhD from the University of Georgia, and when she told me that, she said, "Go Dogs!" I don't know what that means. So we don't really have that same kind of sport culture in Canada, but go Dogs! Or if you don't like the dogs, go another team. Anyway, I'm really excited to talk with Kristen, and let's go over to Zoom to see what she has to say. Kristen, thank you so much for agreeing to talk with me this week. It is amazing how much has changed since we first connected on Twitter, and I'm just extra excited for us to have this conversation, so thank you.
Thank you for having me.
There's a fly around, which is why there are cats. So very excited. Just letting everyone know what kind of conversation this is going to be. Before we get started, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I am an assistant professor at Clemson University, so I prepare pre-service teachers who are going to teach high school social studies. My research focuses on Black teachers and the ways they talk about race as well as their experiences. And I also study the way race plays out in social studies texts. Now, when I say text, that is a large umbrella term that could mean actual literary text with words like textbooks, or it could be historical sites that students might go on field trips to visit. I got my PhD at the University of Georgia. Go Dogs. And I'm a former middle school teacher. I'm really grateful to the students I taught because I learned more in those years about life probably than in the decades leading up to that time. So, yeah.
It's funny you said Go Dogs because in my introduction to you, I was like, in her bio she sent me, she said Go Dogs. I don't know what that means, but like, sure. So it's funny you said that. I'm glad I put it in the introduction. Your middle school teaching, was that in Georgia?
It was.
Yeah.
So I taught in the Metro Atlanta area, and then I also taught in Athens, Georgia.
And it's like middle school 7, 8, which are already difficult years to teach.
Yes. Middle school students are full of energy and questions and are trying to figure out how to cope with the changes that are happening in their lives. But they're fun and they're interesting. So it was a good time.
I feel like with middle school, it's either they're still very young, and that's surprising, or they are very mature, and that is surprising. And that it takes a lot of trust to be able to develop a good community. But when it happens, like that middle ground between being really mature and being really immature allows for some really positive things to happen. So thank you for bringing your experience as a middle school teacher, but also as a social studies teacher educator to this conversation.
Thank you.
So we'll get started. I ask everyone the same 3 questions, but the context has changed quite a lot since when we first started talking about pandemic pedagogy. So the first question is about whether or not your ideas about history have changed during COVID. And what I found interesting was I had talked to some historians that were like, after things like the Spanish flu, there were pushes for greater rights and greater equity. And what is so interesting is this revolution is happening, like, that's a word that you used, right in the middle of it, which demonstrates how, like, the importance, but also like how it was so close to being there to begin with. So do you have any thoughts about how your ideas about history have shifted and changed, if at all, during this time?
So until about 2 weeks ago, I would have said no. But the last 2 weeks have really led me to ask a lot of questions about how change happens, right? So what we've seen in the last 2 weeks, I feel like is something that I haven't seen in my lifetime. And so I'm wondering, what are the conditions that allow this kind of rebellion, this kind of uprising to happen? Because George Floyd was not even the first Black person to die at the hands of police during this pandemic, right? So what happened now, it took me back to 2012 when Trayvon Martin was murdered, to 2013 when George Zimmerman was acquitted, to Michael Brown's death in Ferguson, to Eric Garner. And it just made me wonder what has happened in those last few years for us to get to this point. And the reason I asked that question is because I went to a protest in 2013 after George Zimmerman was acquitted, and nearly everyone in the crowd was Black. But if you look at the protests today, they are an actual multiracial coalition out there protesting. So I've been wondering what has happened. How did the stars align for this moment to be happening, where corporate entities are putting out statements saying that Black Lives Matter, when just a few years ago, Colin Kaepernick was essentially blackballed by the NFL for protesting police brutality towards Black Americans, right? And there was a whole lot of hubbub that involved the President of the United States. But what's happened since then? Like, how did we get to this moment? So is it because 40 million people are unemployed and they don't have sports or work or kids' activities and those other things to distract them? Is it because of the continuous news cycle of this, right? So I don't watch the videos when they come out because it's traumatic, and I don't need to watch the video to know what happened, essentially, right? But the video of George Floyd in particular, that image was everywhere. I'm not a consistent cable news watcher. I usually watch like the morning news and the evening news, and that's it. But that image was everywhere, so you couldn't get away from it. Was it people watching that long video and watching the life like leave his body? I really am really interested in what happened to create this kind of energy around the need to address different forms of racism. So yeah, it's really garnered a lot of questions for me, more so than like changing the way I think about history.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because Angela Davis said I saw it on Twitter, but she did a video that said she also has never seen anything like this, right? And like, I mean, Angela Davis has been such a foundational person from Black Power onwards, that for her to say that, I saw someone on Twitter saying like, thank you for just validating that, because I'm so confused right now about like how this is placed in history, kind of like the questions that you're having. And so to say that, it's like, yes, like what is happening at this moment? And it's interesting you say distraction, because like there aren't distractions like sports and childcare, because that's not something I've heard a lot. I've heard a lot more of like, in more of this like kind of like charitable discourse, like, oh, well, the pandemic has really highlighted the structural inequities, and so this has provided a space for people to talk through. And so it's kind of, I mean, both of those things can be true, but it's kind of interesting how they come together. And to me, it really highlights like how multi-layered history is. Like, what are those elements that are going to be remembered when historians are writing about this?
Right. That's really interesting. I posed this question on Facebook, maybe on Sunday, just because I had been thinking about it for a while, and I checked a little earlier, and so far there are 62 comments. So
I'll have to read them.
They have lots of thoughts about this. But people also mentioned like there's a growing distrust because we've been given different kinds of information around the coronavirus and what works, what doesn't work. Lots of untruths have been told, or mistruths. But yeah, there are
alternative facts.
Indeed.
Because
Indeed.
They're still facts. They're just alternative.
Right.
Right.
But yeah, so before George Floyd's murder, we were already given all of these things to create what I would call a pretty unstable environment, right? So it's kind of like the powder keg was loading and being ready to be ignited. And before George Floyd was murdered, there was the murder of Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia. And the video of that murder ran the course of social media and the news networks. And Breonna Taylor was murdered in her sleep at her home. So a lot is leading up to this moment. And as a Black woman, I'm excited. I hope that substantive change comes. The symbolic gestures are cute, but I would love to see substantive policy changes come from this. The history teacher in me is really interested in what creates this moment. But as an activist and a person who realizes that there's much more change that needs to be made, wants to know what happens to create change, right? So if we can figure out how that happens, then we can get necessary change created. Hopefully it doesn't require a pandemic every time. You're muted. You're muted.
I said, here's hoping.
Right.
No
right.
Every time. But I mean, right, the day before he was murdered, there was also the video of Amy Cooper, right? Threatening, like, and weaponizing African American. Like, that is clearly a weapon. And so I think also, like, people that maybe didn't really understand how and why that was so problematic could see it literally the next day.
Right.
And maybe that's why more people have wanted to become involved than they did for Black Lives Matter a couple years ago. I mean, of course, it's all these different things at once, but hopefully it doesn't take a pandemic. And you know, I had spoke to Natasha Henry, who's the president of the Ontario Black History Society here in, well, obviously in Canada, like 2 days before all of this happened. And one thing we were talking about was with remote online teaching, she was saying that, like, there is even more of a focus on kind of a traditional curriculum, so less room for culturally relevant teaching practices and resources. And so there's a lot more white focus, Eurocentric focus. And we were both kind of talking about, like, when we get back to our classrooms, what will that feel like for people? Will there be such a desire for things to feel normal that it will go back to the same in ways that are even more problematic than they were before? Like, you know, like, exacerbating the inequities of education was such a big theme across all the different videos. And like, this moment is highlighting that in such strong ways.
Yeah, I honestly feel like if we go back to teaching history the way we did 6 months ago, we have wasted this moment. There are lots of teachers who want to do better, right? So, like you were just saying about history and layers, there's lots of layers to teaching history, right? Mm-hmm. Because one, people can't teach what they don't know, right? Mm-hmm. So one, we have to help teachers, history teachers in particular, become more knowledgeable of Black history and the histories of other people of color. We also need to make our history more inclusive, right? So in the US, people of Black Americans usually show up at enslavement, Reconstruction, and the Civil Rights Movement. Like, no Black people lived through the Great Depression or something like that. Like, that's how it plays out. Asian Americans usually only show up at the Chinese Exclusion Act and Japanese incarceration. So that's really problematic for a number of reasons. So, but if we can galvanize this moment, teachers can really take advantage of resources and professional development and go back into classrooms in August or online. I have no idea what's actually going to happen, but be prepared to teach a diverse group of students the history of a diverse group of people.
You know, one of the things that I try to advocate in my work is, like, it's okay for you as a teacher to be like, I don't know this stuff, let's explore it together. Because when you hold yourself so tightly to being an expert, you are setting yourself up to only teaching what you know. And if you have never been exposed to these histories, you don't know them. And so it is extra scary. And you might, like that combined for white teachers, that combined with like a fear of desettling their own white privilege means it just gets replicated. Like for me, a lot of things that I've been hearing in the series is people really wanting to prioritize like student care and emotional well-being and building relationships with students. So if we can like bring that to our classrooms, we can explore these histories together and be like, yeah, I didn't know this. Let's learn together.
Right.
So sorry.
No, I was agreeing with you, so go ahead.
Okay. So, well, this brings me to my second question, although we kind of already like talked about it, but do you think history teaching will change after this moment? Like a lot of people say should, right? You're saying should, everyone's saying should. Do you think it will change? What would that look like? What would that work look like? People can't see you right now, but you do not look, you do not look optimistic.
The difference between will and should is a big one, right? Mm-hmm. So it involves helping teachers learn new material. It involves actual structural changes, right, from the state level, because in a lot of cases, teachers are held accountable for teaching like state standards. And so that they stick to that for that reason. So if we could get state standards that are more inclusive or actually allow more room, like the state of South Carolina actually just moved to a new set of history standards that are all inquiry-based. And so they allow a lot more room for teachers to bring in different kinds of content because the standards aren't content-based. They're actually based on students engaging in inquiry. So lots of stakeholders would need to be involved for those structural changes to happen. And those structural changes take a long time. So I think that history teaching will look different in some places where the teachers might be more equipped to do so. But I am concerned about whether or not it will actually happen at large. But I would love for teachers to even take advantage of like oral histories or having their students interview people to talk about like their engagement. So if they know someone who marched or who protested in some other form or fashion, to talk to them about that and what that was like and why they engaged in it. I think we don't take advantage of that kind of stuff nearly enough. Schools have looked the same for a very, very long time. So I am cautiously optimistic that some change will, I feel like I sound like a politician. I'm cautiously optimistic.
I was actually going to say you sound like Sam Cooke, a change is going to come.
Yes, but it takes time, and my concern is about the momentum slowing down in that process. But another one of the changes that should happen would be, this moment didn't happen because of like one leader, right? That's what I love about the Black Lives Matter movement. It's really grassroots, right? So my colleague Ashley Woodson talks about messianic master narratives. And let's take Martin Luther King, for example. So this is going to be an oversimplification, but it's pretty realistic. Students essentially learn that like Martin Luther King marched and gave a speech, and then Black people got their rights. What that does is actually way more harmful than a lot of teachers realize. So it makes kids feel like if they can't be Martin Luther King, they can't contribute. When in reality, the movement was lots and lots and lots of people, right? So there were even lots of other leaders. Women in particular, I'm still a little upset that I didn't learn about some of the women involved in the movement until I was in graduate school. But like the Ella Bakers and the Diane Nashes and the Fannie Lou Hamers of the world also were pivotal to the civil rights movement. But students don't learn about that. They learn about one guy who marched and gave a speech. Maybe you learn that he went to jail and wrote a letter there, but that's about it. So hopefully we can at least start there with reforming or revolutionizing the way that we teach social movement in schools.
There's a couple things there that I want to pick up on, and I'll start with the last thing you said, like that you are upset that you didn't learn about women that were involved with the movements. So the John Lewis trilogy, graphic novel trilogy, and also Selma, directed by
Ava DuVernay.
Yes, thank you. Both of those texts really highlight women's presence in a way that I have read other graphic novels, like one by the same artist that did the John Lewis book, that have women like totally absent. And you can watch whole documentaries about Martin Luther King and never see women. And both of those sets of texts show that women are there and they are involved. And yes, it's a different type of patriarchy during that time. So women weren't involved in the same way that you and I could be now. But that contribution of cooking and housing, some of these leaders, it was essential to the leadership of that work. And I think that, one of the things one of the concerns that I have, that I know that a lot of people share this, is that people are going to bring these narratives in their classroom in harmful ways and in very simplistic ways. And I think that being thoughtful about text, which I know what your research is on, being thoughtful about text and just thinking about and deconstructing, what am I looking at, what am I hearing, what am I seeing, can help work through those histories, but in ways that aren't hey, guys, racism, right? Because that is going to be more harmful.
Right. So one of my favorite activities to do with my pre-service history teachers is to talk about narratives and the way they're constructed, right? So we watched this video about Thomas Jefferson that is very typical of the narrative we all learned in school. And then I teach them about Sally Hemings, and usually most of them have never heard of her or her children. So Thomas Jefferson is usually glorified in history classes. He wrote the Declaration of Independence. He did a lot for the foundation of our nation. But he also was a slave owner who repeatedly raped one of his slaves, right? And she bore his children. People need to learn more complete histories, I'll put it that way. But so in that same day, I have them read a page of the textbook from the first year I taught. And the section that they read is about Rosa Parks. So Rosa Parks is usually the one woman that students learn about in the civil rights movement. So the textbook section about Rosa Parks describes her. It says, Rosa Parks, a tired middle-aged seamstress, blah, blah, blah. And then I teach them what actually happened and how the Women's Political Council of Montgomery had actually planned the entire Montgomery bus boycott before she got on the bus, how she was actually a freedom fighter and had been working for years, if not decades, with the NAACP. She had attended the Highlander Folk School. Rosa Parks had done all this activist work, and she's reduced to a tired middle-aged seamstress in this textbook that thousands of children are reading every year. It's pretty infuriating. So giving teachers access to that kind of information is really important.
I think one of the things that infuriates me about that Rosa Parks narrative is that her work with the NAACP was based on like gendered and racial violence, right? Because she was a sexual assault investigator, and like to take that away from the narrative is such a different form of violence on top of the work that she was already doing. As someone that's interested in women's history, to be able to take that very gendered nature out it's extra infuriating. So this could lead to the third question about whether or not this moment will allow us to imagine a new we after this. So imagining a new we is something that I started to articulate when I was watching how teachers, particularly white teachers, would really other their students of color. And even though they're like, oh no, it's all Canadian history, it's all American history, but we will get to those histories for those students and those other things later. Let's just focus on our national history first. And that we really need to have these greater circles of inclusion to force ourselves to understand that we are nations, that we are transnational countries that are made up of different things than the stories we tell ourselves. So do you see this moment as allowing us to be able to imagine a new we in different ways, or in better ways, or maybe you don't think that's a useful concept at all? Any thoughts?
I think we have to imagine we as the most inclusive we possible, right? So if Black Lives Matter, that means Black women's lives matter. That means Black LGBTQ plus lives matter. That means Black kids' lives matter. That means Black trans lives matter. So when we're talking the histories of Black people, or Black Americans at least, we need to be teaching all of those. So as far as women, that includes women of all stripes of life, right? We have to bring the margins to the middle, essentially. One of the things I think happens is people in the center forget about people at the margins, and they'll bring a few more in and leave most people at the margins. But the people at the margins right now are fed up, right? Mm-hmm. So if the people whose lives have been centered in everything actually want some kind of structural change, which seems to be the case right now, right? Like I was talking about that like multiracial coalition that seems to be happening right now. I do think that we can leave this moment with a more inclusive we than we have right now. At the same time, I'm sure that there are people that are being left out, and we who have more privilege than they have to make the effort to bring them towards the middle.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that like we should be imagining different we's as well, because when those margins come to the middle, it shouldn't just be the same thing replicated, but right, just looking slightly different. Like those margins should really shift what the we looks like, So thank you for that. That was great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I did want to say something about, you were mentioning earlier teachers who would like say, oh, we'll teach you about the histories of people of color for those students. Then white kids need to know the histories of people of color too, right? Mm-hmm. So white students also need to know that people of color have made incredible contributions to the history of their countries. So histories of people of color are not only for students of color. So I think it's really imperative that teachers understand that.
Yeah, I mean, an example I often use with white teachers, as a white person myself, obviously, I feel like I'm like glowing right now with this particular light and the fact I am so hot in the middle of the summer, that like I see Black history as my history too, because the changes and the resistance and the resilience inform the world that I live in, but also the white supremacy that informs so much of that activism is part of who I am as a white person. And in understanding that, it's a lot easier to understand that this is not separate history from me. This is something that I have to think about and grapple with and learn from in order to teach better and think better and do better. This separation for me has never felt, I never understood it. And I went to elementary school for a couple of years in Florida, actually, in the southern United States. And the most like isolated from history as I felt was in 1992 during the 500th anniversary of Columbus coming to America. And I was just like, this is so confusing. Like, as a young Canadian student, I didn't understand this patriotism. I felt so isolated, but to me, it demonstrated a type of nationalism that did not like fit with how I understood the world. And I think that if those types of narratives are comfortable, then those are good invitations to push. Like, it's okay to be uncomfortable to change things. Like, that's how change happens.
Absolutely. I was in elementary school in '92, and I don't remember any of that.
I think you're a little younger than me. I was 10 in 1992.
Oh, I was 8.
Oh, it was a pretty traumatic year. Like, I went from Canada to Florida, and all of a sudden everyone was like singing these songs, and I was like, I don't get it. I have no idea what's happening.
I can imagine.
Yeah. Kristen, thank you so much. This has been fantastic. Thank you for agreeing to speak with me this week. It's been a real pleasure, and I hope we stay connected.
Thank you. I hope so as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I was saying to people too, like, it will be interesting to touch base when things settle, although that feels so different to say that now, to see how things have changed. So I will definitely be in touch. So hopefully we can continue.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Bye.